Hello, historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. In this video, we'll go over the AS European option, the Russian Revolution, 1894 to 1921. This time period signifies the end of the Romanov dynasty and the beginning of the Soviet Union. Although this video is meant for AS, IGCSE students could find it useful as well, especially if they're doing the depth study for Russia, coursework, or paper 4. Please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe so other people can find it as well. With that, sit back, relax, get a drink and your notebook, and let's learn about late-stage Tsarism and the birth of the Soviet Union. This is the last video in the AS European option set. We've already covered the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and Germany. For Russia, it's very limited in terms of the scope compared to IGCSE, so I think it's actually quite easy. If you haven't studied Russia as your depth study, if you've done Germany or one of the other ones, you just need to break up the time frame from 1894 to 1921 into definitive sections. For example, 1894 to 1905, that is the Witte era, Sergei Witte, early stages of Nicholas's reign. After the 1905 revolution, there's another era that goes up to the beginning of World War I, and that is the Pyotr Stolypin era. So you can look him up. These two men are the key economic and political people of this time period coming up to World War I. Then, of course, you have the 3 years that Russia fights in World War I, and it's a disaster for the country, causing revolution. And then after the October Revolution of 1917, from 1917 to 1921, is the consolidation of power under the Bolsheviks and the Red Army's victory in the Civil War. On to today's agenda. What were the causes and outcomes of the 1905 revolution up to 1914? Looking before the 1905 revolution, it's very useful to know the state of the Russian Empire in the time of Nicholas II. He was a relatively young czar, inexperienced, and he left most of the heavy lifting to Sergei Witte, who did this state capitalism to Russia to bring it into line with the other European powers, such as Germany. It was effective in many ways, but it took a tremendous toll on the working population, people that came from the countryside and moved to St. Petersburg to work in the factories. It was quite awful living conditions in the capital and in Moscow and other big cities, creating this undercurrent of discontent. All it needed was a spark, and that spark was the terrible performance of the Russian army in the Russo-Japanese War. Looking after 1905, there was another guy who was brought in who was trying to save the tsardom, basically, because Nicholas sure couldn't do it. So this other noble was named Pyotr Stolypin. And Stolypin is quite an interesting guy. I think he's probably the most fascinating person in this time period, but that's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with me. He's really brutal. He manages to rig the Duma elections. So after the 1905 revolution, there was, on paper at least, a constitutional monarchy, but Stolypin rigs the elections to fill the Duma with conservatives. He creates a bunch of reforms for land. He's an aristocrat trying to save the system. Again, highly unpopular. Due to his brutality, he would go to the villages, and if people were confiscating land or anything, he would hang them, and the noose was called Stolypin's necktie. He's eventually going to be assassinated in Kiev. Even though he's gone, his reforms are still kind of plugging along up until World War I. What were the causes and immediate outcomes of the February Revolution in 1917, and how and why did the Bolsheviks gain power in October 1917? 1917 is the operative year of this entire theme. You can study this for months. The two key revolutions, the February and October revolutions. The first one, the February Revolution, is the fall of the Tsar, and the second one is the fall of the provisional government and the rise of the Bolsheviks. And how were the Bolsheviks able to consolidate their power up to 1921? We'll talk about the key people, Lenin and Trotsky, in great detail. The nature of the Tsarist regime under Nicholas II was despotic, authoritarian, medieval. He believed in the divine right of kings, thinking the peasants should try to impress him and should serve him and not the other way around. It was out of place. It was anachronistic. Key events of the revolution of 1905: Bloody Sunday. This is a peaceful march in St. Petersburg, which is violently repressed. People carrying signs begging the Tsar for help, and they get gunned down, so that's not going to win you any fans. This will cause a massive uprising. If you've ever heard of the battleship Potemkin, this is from this event, the 1905 revolution. There's a lot of different things going on, but it eventually will not topple the Tsar and will lead to this thing called the October Manifesto, which is a temporary retreat by the Tsar to stay in power, basically. He will then try to whittle back and erode the gains of the 1905 revolution and the October Manifesto in the following years. The man sent to reassert Tsarist authority is Stolypin. It's a great relationship him and the Tsar have. Stolypin is trying his best to save the Tsar, and the Tsar absolutely hates Stolypin's guts. The Tsar just hates everyone who tells him what to do. He has the maturity of basically a 3-year-old. So it's an amazing psychological profile of this man-child who is in charge of the largest country in the world. The things you need to know about the parliaments, the Dumas, are: the first one gets dissolved almost immediately, as does the second one, and Stolypin fixes the vote by voting requirements that is just completely made up of aristocrats and landowners and these types of things. So the third one lasts for its full term. The fourth one is dissolved for World War I. The extent of opposition to Tsarist rule: there's a lot of discontent in Russian society, from the poor farmers in the countryside who have to deal with famine to the industrial workers in St. Petersburg that are disgusted by their living conditions and the pay that they receive for this backbreaking work, then to walk down the street and see aristocrats drinking champagne and eating caviar and not having to work at all, so having it rubbed in their face starts to really grind on the millions of people that have moved from the countryside to the capital to work. The unfairness of the system, the secret police, which is known as the Okhrana, were arresting socialists and communists, or anybody that was considered left-wing or opposed to the monarchy was thrown into jail or even put into internal exile in Siberia. So there's plenty of opposition to the Tsar. It's just that the manifestation of this opposition can only break through when there is massive hardship due to failures militarily. All of this opposition is like kindling and gasoline. All it needs is a spark, and the sparks do come in the form of military failures, first against Japan and second against the Central Powers in World War I. Political, social, and economic effects of the First World War. From August 1914, Russia starts to suffer heavy defeats, and by 1917, the country is completely exhausted. We'll see the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II and the end of 300 years of Romanov rule. Even worse than losing battle after battle, Nicholas II actually goes to the front, and he's not schooled in any kind of modern military tactics, weapons, anything like that. He's very good at marching in a parade and wearing a uniform with a lot of shiny medals. While he's at the front, he lets his wife and a complete lunatic run the country, who's pictured there, Rasputin. I can't find the words to describe putting Rasputin basically in charge of the country. It is beyond insane. You can read up on that and see how absolutely bonkers it was. Rasputin will be assassinated at the end of 1916, but by that time, the damage is already done. For the February Revolution, I want you to know that it is a revolution from above. What does that mean? There's two types of revolutions. One is the revolution from above, meaning the people at the top of society no longer have any confidence in the leadership of the government and they want to change. So the aristocrats, the military officers, they lose faith in the Tsar and are no longer willing to support him, leading to his abdication. Revolution from below is when the masses rise up against the government, and that's what is going to happen in the October Revolution. In the meantime, there is the provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky eventually. The provisional government is in a very tough position from day one. They have the war going on. They have the Germans bringing Lenin into the country from Switzerland. They have massive economic problems. It is incredibly difficult to form a democracy under these wartime conditions, and ultimately they will fail, and Lenin will overthrow them in the October Revolution. How did the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government? The man you really have to know, besides Lenin, is Trotsky. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, aka Trotsky, was a massive figure. He's one of the most important people of the 20th century. He pretty much kills democracy in Russia, him and Lenin. So the provisional government is immediately challenged by this thing called the Petrograd Soviet. And the first thing the Petrograd Soviet does is execute this thing called Order Number 1, which claims control of the armed forces, or saying the armed forces cannot be used without their permission. So there is a short game and a long game. Trotsky will eventually overtake the Petrograd Soviet and then move on the provisional government in the October Revolution. The Military Revolutionary Committee is set up, which is an armed wing of the government. This is in response of a few events that I'll mention very briefly, and you can research them. One is called the July Days, and the other one is called the Kornilov Affair. So those are the two key events in between the massive revolutions in 1917. For all the propaganda, the October Revolution is a complete dud. There's no dramatic battles or anything. All of that is propaganda. The Red Guards just slowly and methodically take over the city. Nobody's willing to defend the provisional government. They take the post office, they take the bridges, and then they go into the Winter Palace. And the most exciting thing that happens is they find the Tsar's wine collection, and they all get hammered, basically. So there's no storming the gates with the red flag. There's no firefight in the Winter Palace that's, looking like some kind of movie. It is pretty pedestrian. But there you go. That is the end of the provisional government and the beginning of what would become the Soviet Union. The people that are overthrown by Lenin aren't going to take this lying down, and we will see that the October Revolution is the end of the provisional government, but it's also the beginning of the Russian Civil War. With the success of the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks moved the capital to Moscow. But above all, Lenin knows one thing: his survival, not just the survival of his government, but his life, because he'll be killed for sure if he fails to win militarily, is that to win the Civil War, they're going to have to pull Russia out of World War I. In order to do so, they sign a treaty with the Germans called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Massive amounts of population, of coal mines, of railroads. It is a robber's treaty. It's so bad even Trotsky says no to this, but Lenin tells him to march right back there and to sign whatever the Germans offer him, because he needs to get out of the war in order to make sure the revolution survives. Lenin signs this terrible treaty hoping that Germany will lose World War I. It's a gamble, and it pays off for him, because the Allies will be able to fend off this last German charge and sign the armistice with Germany, leading to the eventual ending of the war and the dissolution of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So this works out relatively well for Lenin, with these territories and financial incentives to Germany now officially torn up. Bolshevik victory, there's a lot of reasons the Red Army defeats the White Army. First of all, there's no real White Army. That's a blanket term for all non-communist groups. So there's Democrats, there's monarchists, there's socialists that aren't communists. It's just a hodgepodge of forces that don't really cooperate with each other. Whereas Trotsky has built up the Red Army to be highly unified. It controls all the industrial centers, so it can pump out ammunition and weapons. It is brutal and ruthless, going into the villages and saying, okay, you're conscripted into the Red Army or we will shoot you. So the ruthlessness and the dedication of Trotsky makes a huge difference. War communism means all of the resources of the state will go towards the Red Army and winning the war. This will lead to famines and a lot of suffering throughout the civilian population. It gets to be so bad that in 1921, the Kronstadt sailors, who are my favorite group in this entire theme, they're the Greek tragedy figures of the Russian Revolution. They were wanting to have a better, more fair, more just society in Russia, and they're ultimately betrayed and eliminated by the Bolsheviks. Trotsky sends a general named Tukhachevsky to kill every last Kronstadt sailor. So idealists are now all dead, and the people that were the most fervent supporters of the revolution are now gone. This leads Lenin to say, all right, we need to make a change. So we are going to have a new economic plan and get rid of war communism. The new economic plan is limited capitalism just to get a little bit of food security. Many of the Bolsheviks see this as a betrayal. It's a surrender to capitalism. Lenin says it's just a temporary retreat and will be done away with in time. Wrapping things up now, the Tsar is incompetent, inept, and blind to the suffering of his people. This eventually will get him killed. He will be killed by the Bolsheviks after the revolution. Just know why he was unpopular, his despotic rule, his views that are straight out of the Middle Ages in a changing world where we're starting to see industrial capitalism take over the country. Something has to give. It always does, just like in the French Revolution. The 1917 revolutions, these two revolutions are so important. I don't think I need to stress that anymore. Please spend many, many lessons going over both of them. And the Russian Civil War, it's fairly one-sided. There are times when the whites are getting close to St. Petersburg and Moscow, but the Bolsheviks control the railroads. They control the factories. They have ruthless leaders, Dzerzhinsky, Trotsky, Lenin, whereas the whites are divided. They're geographically dispersed over this gigantic landmass. They have to go on foot or by horse. If you really look at it in the final analysis, there were a ton of advantages for the Red Army over the White Army. The Red Army will win the Russian Civil War. Just know the key reasons why.